There is a question that civilization has avoided for centuries, not because it lacks an answer, but because the answer is too uncomfortable to confront. What if the very thing that makes you a good person is the same thing that is slowly destroying you? Not metaphorically, not philosophically, literally. What if your kindness is a wound that never heals? What if your instinct to help is a mechanism that others have learned to exploit with surgical precision? What if the moral identity you've built throughout your life, being a good person, is the most efficient cage ever created around a human being? The world will never tell you this. Your family won't. Your friends won't. Society certainly won't. Because the world, it needs may good people remain unaware of their own destruction. The world needs givers who never stop giving. It needs people who say yes when everything inside them is screaming no. This video is for those who are tired of screaming in silence. In 2013, organizational psychologist Adam Grant of the Wharton School of Business published research that shook the academic world. Not because it was radical, but because it confirmed what most people already felt in their bones, but never dared to say aloud. Grant studied thousands of professionals in various fields and identified 3 fundamental human archetypes: givers, who contribute without expecting anything in return; takers, who extract without remorse; and negotiators, who operate on calculated reciprocity. His discovery was devastating in its simplicity. The least successful people in virtually every field he studied were the givers. They were passed over for promotions. They burned out faster. They were exploited by colleagues, manipulated by friends, and discarded by organizations the moment they ceased to be useful. But here's what Grant also discovered: the part that rarely makes the headlines. The people more. Successful donors were also successful. The difference between the top donor and the bottom donor wasn't intelligence. It was the ability to say no. And this is where Carl Jung enters the conversation. Because Jung understood, decades before modern neuroscience confirmed it, that what we refuse to confront within ourselves will consume us from the outside in. The good person who cannot protect themselves not only suffers. This person invites suffering itself, repeatedly, systematically, with a smile on their face and an apology already forming on their lips. Throughout this video, we're not going to tell you to love yourself more or set healthy boundaries, empty phrases that dissolve the moment they collide with real life. Instead, let's delve into the psychological and neurological architecture of kindness itself and expose the precise mechanisms through which that kindness becomes self-destructive. You will understand why your brain has been trained to experience your own no as a threat. You will see how good people unknowingly teach others to exploit them. You will confront the paradox that the most moral impulse that exists, the desire to help, can become the most dangerous force in your own life. And in the end, you will understand that becoming a sustainable human being is not a betrayal of your goodness. It is its highest expression. Before we begin, I invite you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, like the video, and share it with someone you know who needs to hear what's going to be said here. Thank you very much for your attention. Let's get to the video. Chapter 1. The Neuroscientific Cage of the Invisible Cage. The brain of a good person has been rewired, through years of conditioning, to experience the act of refusing as a physical danger. This is not a metaphor, it's neurobiology. The human amygdala, that ancient almond-shaped structure buried deep within the temporal lobe, doesn't distinguish between a tiger in the forest and social rejection. Both are registered as threats. Both trigger the same cascade of cortisol and adrenaline. Both activate the same survival imperative: do something now to make this stop. For most people, this system is calibrated by childhood experiences. And for someone who grew up in an environment where love was conditional, where approval had to be earned through obedience, where conflict meant punishment, where being good was the only reliable safety strategy, the amygdala learns a catastrophic equation. Saying no is tantamount to danger. To disappoint someone is equivalent to abandonment. Prioritizing yourself is equivalent to not being loved. In his seminal work on complex trauma, psychiatrist Pete Walker identified what he called fawn answer, a fourth survival mode alongside fight, flight, and freeze. The fawn response is the automatic impulse to please, accommodate, and become what the threatening person needs you to be in order for the danger to cease. The tragedy lies here. The fawn response doesn't seem like fear. It seems like kindness. It seems like generosity. It seems virtue. And so, the cage becomes invisible because it is built precisely from the qualities that the person has been taught to be proud of. Consider the life of Simone Weil, the French philosopher and mystic, one of the most brilliant minds of the 20th century. Weil was, by any measure, a person of extraordinary moral courage. She abandoned a prestigious academic career to work in factories alongside laborers. She refused food during World War II in solidarity with the occupied French population. She donated virtually everything she owned. She died in 1943 at the age of 34 of tuberculosis, complicated, her doctors noted, by voluntary starvation. She had refused to eat more than she believed the poorest people in occupied France were consuming. Her kindness was real. The sacrifice was genuine. But somewhere between moral commitment and self-annihilation, Simone Weil had lost the ability to distinguish between giving freely and being unable to stop. The cage had become identity, and identity had become death. You see this pattern today in every workplace, in every family, in every relationship. The employee who stays late every night, not out of ambition, but because they can't bear the guilt of leaving while others are still working. The friend who answers every call at midnight, not out of love, but because the silence of not answering seems like a moral failing. The partner who always apologizes first, even when they're not. Wrong because the discomfort of an unresolved conflict is unbearable. These are not character strengths. They are neurological patterns, learned, automatic, and profoundly resistant to simple willpower. The first act of liberation is cognitive, not behavioral. Before changing what you do, you need to understand, because do it. The next time you feel the urge to say yes when you want to say no, pause. Not to suppress the urge, but to observe it. Ask yourself, am I helping because I want to, or because I'm afraid of what will happen if I don't help? The honest answer to that question is the beginning of everything. Chapter 2. The Map of Exploration. How good people train others to use it. Good people don't simply attract exploitation. Through a series of unconscious behavioral signals, these people they teach. Others believe that exploitation is permitted. This is the principle that most people find most difficult to accept, because it implies a form of responsibility that seems profoundly unfair. You are not responsible for being exploited, but you can be responsible for the conditions that make exploitation possible. Social psychologist Robert Cialdini spent decades studying the mechanics of influence and persuasion. One of his fundamental observations was that human beings calibrate their behavior in response to feedback. Not consciously, not maliciously, but automatically. We do more of what works and less of what doesn't. We push doors that open. A good person without limits is a door that always opens. When someone asks a favor and the kind person agrees despite the obvious discomfort, the person asking records, this works. When a good person says no but gives in after a little pressure, the person asking notes, persistence works. When a kind person apologizes for not being able to help more, the person who asks records it, guilt works. Over time, these micro-lessons accumulate into a relational dynamic that seems, to those who explore it, completely natural. They are not monsters. They are simply people who have learned, through repeated experience, exactly how much pressure is needed to extract what they want from a given person. The good person, without understanding, wrote the manual. The relationship between Fyodor Dostoevsky and his brother Mikhail offers a historical illustration rarely discussed in psychological literature. Dostoevsky, whose psychological insight into human nature remains unparalleled in the history of literature, was, in his personal life, a man incapable of refusing those he loved. He gave away money he didn't have. He absorbed debts that weren't his. He wrote under impossible deadlines partly because he had committed his advances to support family members who never ceased to need more. His notebooks reveal a man who understood, with terrifying clarity, the psychological dynamics in which he was trapped and from which he could not escape. He saw the pattern. He named it. He wrote about it in his characters with devastating precision, and he remained imprisoned by him until his death. Understanding exploitation is not the same as being free from it. The architecture of the pattern needs to be dismantled, not just observed. In modern professional environments, this dynamic is pervasive. The colleague who always covers for others becomes the default substitute, not because they are valued, but because they are, reliable in its inability to refuse. The manager who absorbs every team crisis becomes indispensable not because of their leadership, but because of their tolerance for being used. Research on workplace dynamics consistently shows that individuals perceived as too nice receive fewer promotions, not more, because they are seen as lacking the assertiveness necessary for leadership, even when their competence is superior. So, they are not going to explain their refusals. This is counterintuitive, but critical. When you say no and then offer a lengthy justification, you are signaling that the no is negotiable, that enough pressure or counter-argument can change it. A clear and brief refusal, "I won't be able to do that." It communicates purpose in a way that elaborate explanations never can. The explanation is an invitation to negotiate. The limit is a wall. Chapter 3. The Shadow of Virtue. What goodness hides. Every person who has made kindness the center of their identity has built that identity upon the suppression of an equal and opposite force, and that force does not disappear. That force accumulates. Carl Jung called it the shadow. If you follow this channel, you already know that the shadow doesn't mean evil. It simply means everything we choose not to be, compressed in the unconscious and stored with increasing pressure, like gas in a sealed chamber. Jung observed that the more rigorously a person constructs a virtuous persona, the more completely they identify with goodness, altruism, and moral rectitude, the larger and more volatile their shadow becomes. Because every quality denied in the conscious self does not disappear. That quality descends and grows. Anger that is never allowed to fester becomes resentment. Resentment that is never expressed becomes bitterness. Bitterness that is never acknowledged eventually becomes either an explosion or a collapse. That's why the kindest people sometimes explode with disproportionate fury at the slightest provocation. That's why the most dedicated caregivers sometimes experience sudden and terrifying fantasies of completely abandoning everyone who depends on them. That's why the most committed and compliant sometimes reach a point of total psychological collapse, without apparent warning, without obvious cause, like a structure that has supported too much weight for too long. The shadow doesn't ask permission to appear. The shadow simply waits. The life of Leo Tolstoy represents perhaps the most dramatic documented collapse of the shadow in Western intellectual history. Tolstoy, author of War and Peace and Anna Karenina, considered by many to be the greatest novelist ever born, spent the second half of his life meticulously constructing an identity of moral sanctity. He preached nonviolence, radical simplicity, renunciation of property and ego. His followers called him a prophet. He dressed like a peasant. He distributed his possessions. And in private, his diaries reveal a man consumed by anger, sexual desire, wounded vanity, and deep hatred for his own family, especially for his wife Sophia, whom he saw as the obstacle between him and the purity he sought. In 1910, at the age of 82, Tolstoy secretly fled his home in the middle of the night, leaving no address. He died days later in a remote train station, alone, a refugee from a lifetime of performative kindness that had stifled everything human within him. The shadow does not forgive those who ignore it for too long. You recognize this pattern in modern daily life. The person who never complains and suddenly sends a brutal message that destroys a years-long relationship. The professional who always delivers and one day simply disappears. The calm and patient partner who, without any apparent warning, decides they want a divorce. From the outside, it seems inexplicable. On the inside, it was inevitable. The shadow doesn't need to be eliminated. The shadow needs to be integrated. This means allowing, in controlled and conscious doses, the emotions you've spent years suppressing. Anger can be expressed in difficult conversations before it becomes an explosion. Frustration can be named before it becomes resentment. Integrating the shadow is not weakness. It's the difference between a pressure valve and a boiler about to explode. Up to this point, we have established the fundamental pillars of a problem that most people carry throughout their lives without ever naming it. You learned that your brain was neurologically conditioned to experience your own limits as a threat, that through invisible signals, you teach others how to use you, that kindness without integration of the shadow is not virtue. It's a timed bomb. These are the fundamentals, the anatomy of passive destruction, but there is a deeper layer, more subtle, more dangerous. Because up until now, we've talked about what goodness is. He does with you. Now, we need to talk about what kindness is. Transform you. How it alters your perception of reality. How it rewrites your identity until you no longer know who you are without the approval of others. And how, at the most advanced level, it becomes the mechanism by which you unconsciously perpetuate your own imprisonment. The following laws are not for those who prefer the comfort of simple answers. They are for those who are willing to face the mirror to its fullest extent. Chapter 4. The Kidnapped Identity. When you no longer know who you are without the approval of others. A good person who lives for the approval of others lacks an identity. They possess a reflection, and reflections disappear when there is no one to look at them. Edward Deci and Richard Ryan, in self-determination theory, one of the most robust frameworks in modern psychology, distinguish between two fundamental types of motivation. Intrinsic motivation comes from within. You act because the action itself has value for you. Extrinsic motivation comes from outside. You act to gain approval, avoid punishment, or maintain a certain image. Their research unequivocally demonstrates that when kindness operates in extrinsic mode, when you are kind to be approved, generous to be loved, helpful to avoid conflict, the result is not well-being. It is chronic anxiety, a persistent feeling of emptiness, and an increasing dependence on external validation to function. Jean-Paul Sartre would call this bad faith, the state of living someone else's life instead of your own, the refusal to take radical responsibility for one's own existence, the outsourcing of the self. But there is something even more disturbing that Sartre identified. The person acting in bad faith often he knows who is living someone else's life. And it continues, because the weight of authenticity is more terrifying than the safety of conformity. Virginia Woolf's life story offers an extraordinary lens through which to view this mechanism. Woolf, one of the most innovative writers of the 20th century, spent decades navigating between two worlds, the world of her radically original and unclassifiable literary genius, and the world of social and familial expectations that demanded conformity, gentleness, and stability from her. Her letters and diaries reveal a woman in a permanent war with herself. Every time she prioritized her writing, her authentic self, guilt consumed her. Every time she yielded to the demands of others, her adapted self, her writing dried up. What Woolf described as the angel of the house, the idealized female figure of domestic kindness and utter selflessness, was, for her, a more lethal enemy than any literary critic. Killing the angel of the house, she wrote, it was part of a writer's job. She understood that an identity hijacked by the approval of others is not merely a psychological prison. It is a creative assassination, a silencing of the real self in favor of an uninterrupted performance of conformity. On social media, this mechanism has reached an unprecedented scale in human history. Entire platforms have been designed to maximize the cycle of approval and dependency. You post, wait for validation, adjust your behavior based on feedback, and post again. The documented result is an entire generation that literally doesn't know what it thinks or feels about a subject until it sees what others think and feel. Identity has been so completely externalized that the inner self has become inaccessible. But this didn't start with social media. It started in everyone's childhood. Social media only amplified a pattern that already existed. So, practice what the existentialist philosopher would call return to self once a week. Make a decision, any decision, small or large, without consulting anyone, without asking for opinions, without checking for approval. The atrophy of independent judgment is reversed by practice, not theory. Every decision made from within, rather than from without, is a neuron of autonomy being rewired. Chapter 5. Silent Resentment. The poison that kindness produces. All kindness not freely chosen breeds resentment, and accumulated resentment will not only destroy you, it will destroy all your relationships, from the inside out, invisibly and inevitably. Friedrich Nietzsche was the philosopher who most relentlessly dissected this mechanism. He called it resentment, a concept that goes far beyond simple everyday resentment. Nietzschean resentment is the psychological condition of someone who, unable to act directly in the world, unable to say no, to defend themselves, to assert their own will, redirects this frustrated energy inward. They construct a value system in which weakness is renamed virtue, the inability to fight is called pacifism, and submission is presented as goodness. But the anger doesn't disappear, it festers. Nietzsche was not making an argument in favor of cruelty. He was identifying a mechanism of self-deception that, in his view, was more corrosive to human beings than open hostility, because it was invisible to the person who carried it. Modern neuroscience confirms this precisely. Research on emotional regulation demonstrates that chronic suppression of negative emotions does not reduce their physiological intensity. It only reduces awareness of them, while the body continues to pay the price. Elevated cortisol, a compromised immune system, increased blood pressure, and a diffuse irritability that contaminates all interactions. Anton Chekhov, the Russian playwright whose characters are universally recognized for their inability to say what they feel and do what they need to do, wrote about silent resentment with a precision that seems autobiographical. In The Cherry Blossom Garden, The Three Sisters, Uncle Vanya, throughout his mature work, Chekhov portrays characters who spend years, sometimes decades, doing what others need, saying what others want to hear, postponing their own lives in the name of a kindness that no one explicitly asked for and that, in the end, saves no one. Uncle Vanya is perhaps the most devastating portrait, a man who spent 25 years managing his brother-in-law's estate, convinced he was serving genius. When he realizes the professor was mediocre and wasted his own life in voluntary servitude, the result is not serenity. It's an attempted murder. Accumulated resentment has no elegant way out. You recognize this pattern in relationships that suddenly end without apparent explanation, in friendships that inexplicably dissolve, in marriages that collapse after seemingly stable decades. From the outside, it seems inexplicable. Inside, it was the silent accumulation of 1,000 moments when a person said yes when they wanted to say no, and never said it to anyone. Resentment doesn't announce itself. One day, it simply fills all the available space. So, de-develop the habit of incremental expression. Resentment accumulates silently because a good person fears that any expression of dissatisfaction will destroy the relationship. But what destroys relationships is not expression, it's accumulation. Start small, express minor disagreements before they become major ones. Say that something bothered you before it consumes you. The honor of a relationship is not in the absence of conflict, it's in the ability to survive it. Chapter 6. The Redemption of Goodness, How to Transform Vulnerability into Strength. Sustainable kindness doesn't stem from an inability to say no. It stems from the deliberate choice to say yes. And that difference is the distance between servitude and genuine virtue. Viktor Frankl survived Auschwitz, Dachau, and 3 other concentration camps. He lost his wife, his parents, and his brother. He lost the manuscript of his life, a book on psychology that he had hidden in the hem of his coat, and which was destroyed upon arrival at the camp. And from all of this, he extracted an observation that redefined 20th century psychology. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space lies our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. Frankl was not advocating passivity. He was identifying the only place where human dignity is absolutely inaccessible to external forces, the space of conscious choice. The kindness that springs from fear does not inhabit this space. It is an automatic reaction, the product of a conditioned nervous system, not of a free human being. The kindness that springs from deliberate choice is something else entirely. It is the act of someone who it could saying no and choosing to say yes, that it could to withhold and to choose to give, to have clear boundaries and, within those boundaries, to act with genuine generosity. This person cannot be exploited, not because they are cold or calculating, but because every act of kindness they perform is a voluntary act, not an extraction. Nelson Mandela spent 27 years imprisoned on Robben Island. When he was released in 1990, cameras around the world expected anger, or at least bitterness. What they found was something most people had never seen materialized in a real human being: kindness built on steel. Mandela had not survived imprisonment by suppressing his emotions. In his memoirs and interviews, he describes years of anger, pain, and temptation to despair. He integrated all of that. He did not deny it. And when he chose reconciliation, when he chose to build a South Africa not founded on revenge, that choice was not weakness disguised as virtue. It was the most powerful affirmation of human will that the context allowed. He said no to anger, not because he didn't feel it, but because he chose something greater than it. This is the only kindness that does not destroy the one who possesses it. The difference between kindness as weakness and kindness as strength is detectable, and you've probably felt it in other people. There is a type of generous person whose yes carries an invisible weight. You feel that you are incurring a debt, that there will be a cost, that the generosity is not entirely free. This is the yes of fear, of resentment building up, of the person who doesn't know how to say no. And then there's the kind of generous person whose yes feels effortless, who helps without creating an obligation, who refuses without guilt, who is completely present when you are and completely absent when you choose to be. This person is rare and powerful in a way that the world instinctively recognizes, even without knowing how to name it. So, before every act of kindness, before every yes, ask yourself a simple, honest question. If I knew that person would never find out it was me, would I still do it? If the answer is yes, act. If the answer is no or hesitant, you're not being good. You're being strategic in the guise of goodness. And that distinction is the line between virtue and prison. We have reached the end of a journey that, if undertaken honestly, leaves no one unscathed. Let's recap what we've been through together. You learned that your brain has been conditioned to experience your own limits as danger, and that this is not a weakness of character. It's the neurobiology of trauma. You understood that, through invisible behavioral signals, good people actively teach others to explore them. You confronted Jung's shadow, the accumulated force of everything that has been suppressed in the name of virtue, silently awaiting the moment of its own expression. In the second half, you went deeper. You saw how identity can be hijacked by the approval of others until the real self becomes inaccessible. You understood silent resentment, the poison that unchosen kindness produces, slowly and inevitably. And you touched finally on the only form of kindness that does not destroy the one who carries it. That which is born not from the inability to say no, but from the deliberate choice to say yes. There is a phrase that the writer and Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh left as a legacy, and which summarizes everything this video has tried to illuminate. If you don't take care of yourself, you have nothing to offer others. It's not selfishness, it's existential mathematics. The world doesn't need more good people who destroy themselves. The world needs good people who endure, who build their generosity on a foundation that doesn't collapse under the weight of those who know exactly where to apply pressure. Being a good person can destroy you, but it doesn't have to. The difference lies entirely and solely in the space between the stimulus and the response. That space is yours. It always has been. If this video touched you on something you recognize in yourself or someone you know, please share it. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a good person is to show them the unseen price of their kindness. And if you want to continue this conversation, the next video will go even deeper. See you there.